In the shadowed hollows where the ancient ridges of the Appalachians claw at the sky like the fingers of some forgotten god, there lived a woman named Ilara Voss. Her home was a crooked cabin stitched together from warped timbers and the bones of beasts long extinct, perched on soil so rich and black it seemed to swallow light itself. The air there hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and something fouler, a whisper of decay that clung to the leaves and seeped into the streams. Ilara was no stranger to the mountain's secrets. She had been born under their watchful gaze, her bloodline woven into the very roots that twisted beneath the ground. But the mountains, in their inscrutable wisdom, had marked her for a fate more terrible than solitude or madness. It began with a longing that gnawed at her soul, a hollow ache for life to bloom within her barren womb. The villagers spoke of her in hushed tones around flickering hearths, calling her blessed by the old ways, yet cursed by the new. She wandered the fog-veiled trails at dusk, seeking answers from the whispering winds and the gnarled oaks that stood sentinel over forgotten graves. One storm-ravaged night, as thunder cracked the heavens like brittle bones, Ilara ventured deeper into the woods than any soul dared, drawn by a pull she could neither name nor resist. There, in a clearing where the ground pulsed faintly, as if breathing, she uncovered a relic, a stone etched with symbols that writhed like worms in the rain. The ritual that followed was born of desperation, her voice trembling as she invoked forces older than the hills themselves. Words spilled from her lips in a tongue not her own, and the earth responded with a shudder, splitting open to exhale a miasma of rot and promise. When dawn broke, pale and reluctant, Ilara returned to her cabin changed, her belly swelling with the first stirrings of life. But joy was fleeting. The child within her moved not with the vigor of the living, but with a sluggish, unnatural rhythm, as if already half-claimed by the grave. The birth was a nightmare veiled in silence. No cries pierced the night, only a wet, gurgling sigh as the infant emerged, its skin mottled with patches of decay, eyes glassy and unseeing yet somehow aware. It clung to life by a thread, feeding not on milk but on the essence of things withered and gone. Ilara held it close, her tears mingling with the foul ichor seeping from its tiny form, whispering apologies to the shadows that now gathered thicker around her home. And as the seasons turned, more children followed, each one arriving into the world already tainted, their small bodies blooming with fungi and rot, vessels for secrets the mountains refused to keep buried. Whispers spread through the valleys like mist, tales of the mother of rot whose offspring wandered the woods at night, their half-dead forms luring the unwary into the earth's hungry embrace. Ilara's cabin became a place of dread, where the line between life and decay blurred into something profane. Yet in the quiet hours, as she rocked her grotesque brood, she glimpsed a terrible truth. These children were not abominations, but harbingers, born to unravel the fragile veil that separated the world above from the festering void below. And in that realization, the true horror took root, not in the rot itself, but in the inexorable pull of what lay waiting, ancient and insatiable, beneath the skin of the earth. In the dim glow of a university archive buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten time, Elias Thorne, a young historian specializing in Appalachian folklore, sifted through a crate of yellowed manuscripts donated from an estate sale in the remote hollows of West Virginia. The air was thick with the musty scent of mildew and old paper, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. Elias had always been drawn to the margins of history, the tales dismissed as superstition, the whispers that clung to the mountains like eternal fog. His fingers, calloused from years of handling fragile documents, paused on a leather-bound journal wedged between crumbling newspapers from the 1920s. The journal's cover was unmarked save for faint scratches that resembled roots twisting into the hide. As he opened it, a faint odor escaped, like damp soil disturbed after a heavy rain, carrying undertones of something sweeter and more sinister, overripe fruit left to ferment in the dark. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, faded ink detailing births and deaths in a family line that traced back to the early 1800s. But it was a single entry, dated in the autumn of 1897, that seized his breath and held it captive. The writer, a midwife named Cora Hale, described attending a birth in a secluded cabin deep in the ridges. The mother, Ilara Voss, had labored for days, her screams echoing through the woods like the wail of something not entirely human. When the child finally emerged, Cora wrote with trembling precision, it did not cry. Its skin was pallid and mottled, veins visible beneath a translucent sheen, and patches of it appeared already softened, as if decay had begun in the womb. The infant's eyes opened briefly, milky and unfocused, yet they seemed to fix on Cora with an awareness far beyond a newborn's. It lived for 3 days, feeding weakly before slipping away in silence, its tiny body blooming with faint traces of mold even as it drew its last breaths. Cora's account went further, linking Alara's tragedy to an older legend whispered among the mountain folk, a curse laid by ancient spirits dwelling in the earth's depths, entities that resented the intrusion of settlers and punished the bloodlines that dared to propagate on their sacred ground. Women of certain lineages, the tale went, would bear children already half-claimed by rot, born with the mark of the underworld, vessels tainted from conception. Elias read on, page after page revealing similar births in the Voss family stretching back generations, each child arriving into the world in a state of partial death, their bodies betraying the intrusion of something primordial and insatiable. The revelation struck him like cold mist seeping through cracks in the archive walls. This was no mere folktale. The meticulous records, the midwife's sworn testimony, the accompanying sketches of the afflicted infants all pointed to a curse woven into the very fabric of the land. As Elias closed the journal, the odor lingered in his nostrils, and for a moment, he thought he heard a faint rustle in the shadows, as if the mountains themselves had followed the story into the room, waiting to claim acknowledgement. The legend of the Appalachian mother of rot was real, her lineage a bridge between the living world and the slow, inexorable decay that pulsed beneath the ancient ridges. Elias Thorne left the archive with the midwife's journal tucked inside his coat, its weight pressing against his ribs like a second heart. The drive south took him through thinning autumn forests and into the spine of the Appalachians, where the roads narrowed to cracked ribbons of asphalt flanked by walls of laurel and rhododendron. Fog pooled in the valleys as he descended, thick enough to swallow the headlights whole, forcing him to crawl along switchbacks that seemed to loop back on themselves. Signs for towns appeared and vanished, faded paint on warped boards, until he reached the turnoff for Black Hollow, a place marked on no modern map but noted in Cora Hale's careful script as the last known home of the Voss bloodline. The village clung to the mountainside like moss on a decaying log, a scatter of weathered houses with tin roofs rusted the color of dried blood. Chimneys exhaled thin threads of smoke that hung motionless in the damp air, and the only movement came from curtains twitching aside as he passed. Elias parked beside a sagging general store whose single gas pump stood sentinel, its glass face cracked and empty. When he stepped out, the cold wrapped around him immediately, carrying the smell of wet leaves, coal dust, and beneath it all, that same faint sweetness of rot he had first noticed in the journal. An old man sat on a bench outside the store, whittling a stick with a knife that caught what little light pierced the clouds. His eyes, pale and watery, tracked Elias without blinking. "You ain't from here," he said, not a question. Elias introduced himself, mentioned his research into old family stories, careful not to speak the name Voss aloud. The knife paused mid-stroke. "Some stories best left buried, son. Roads out are same as roads in. Remember that." Then the man spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed dark against the gravel and turned his face away. Inside the store, shelves held sparse goods, canned beans, lamp oil, ammunition, and the woman behind the counter watched him with the same guarded stillness. When he asked about lodging, she nodded toward a narrow dirt track leading higher into the ridge. "Widow Greer rents a room. Don't expect much." Her voice was soft, almost kind, yet it carried a warning older than words. Elias thanked her and drove on, the truck's tires crunching over frost-heaved earth until the trees closed in completely and the village disappeared behind him. The cabin appeared suddenly at the end of the track, smoke curling from its chimney into the low sky. As Elias killed the engine, silence rushed in, broken only by the slow drip of water from overhanging branches and something else, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like a cradle rocking though no wind stirred the air. He sat for a long moment, journal in his lap, staring at the dark windows that reflected nothing back. Somewhere deeper in the hollow, a dog began to bark, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. Elias drew a breath that tasted of earth and endings, shouldered his bag, and stepped toward the door, feeling the mountain settle its ancient attention upon him. The morning after his arrival, Elias followed Widow Greer's terse directions down a footpath that wound behind the cabin and into a stand of hemlocks so dense the sunlight arrived only in thin, sickly blades. The air grew cooler with each step, laced with the scent of pine resin and something beneath it, musky, organic, like meat left too long in a damp cellar. He carried the midwife's journal in his pack, along with a small notebook for transcribing whatever fragments of truth he could coax from the living. The path ended at a clearing where 3 houses huddled together, their sidings silvered by decades of weather, porches sagging under the weight of unspoken years. Smoke rose lazily from one chimney, and in the yard of that house an old woman knelt among frost-bitten cabbage rows, her hands buried in the black soil. She wore a faded dress the color of moss, and her hair, iron gray and thick, was braided tight against her skull. When she looked up, Elias saw the family resemblance immediately, skin so pale it seemed translucent, veins faintly blue beneath, and eyes sunken into sockets that carried shadows no amount of rest could erase. She introduced herself as May Voss, great-granddaughter of Alara, and invited him inside without warmth or suspicion, as if strangers bearing questions about the dead were simply part of the rhythm of life here. The house smelled of wood smoke, lye soap, and again that persistent undertone of decay. On the mantel sat framed photographs tinted with age, stern faces staring out, all sharing the same hollowed cheeks, the same soft, bruised look around the mouth. Children, too, posed stiffly in Sunday clothes, their small hands folded in laps, eyes too large and too still. May poured coffee thick as tar into tin cups and sat across from him at a table scarred by generations of knives. When Elias gently mentioned the journal and the births recorded within, her fingers tightened around the cup, knuckles whitening. "We don't speak her name much," she said, voice low, almost reverent. "But the blood remembers." She told him, in fragments, of aunts and cousins who had carried to term only to deliver infants already cool to the touch, skin mottled like spoiled fruit, breathing shallow and wet. Some lived hours, some days, a few long enough to walk the ridges before the rot claimed them fully. The family buried them in unmarked plots up the hollow, close to the roots of the oldest oaks, where the ground stayed soft year-round. Her younger brother, Harlan, appeared in the doorway then, silent as mist. He was tall and thin, his face carrying the same pallor, but worse, patches of skin along his jaw and neck appeared thinned, almost waxy, as if something beneath were pressing outward. He nodded once to Elias but said nothing, only watched with eyes the color of river stones. May glanced at him, then back to Elias, and continued. "It ain't sickness, not like the doctors down in Charleston say. It's older. Tied to this ground. Some of us show it more than others." She lifted her sleeve briefly, revealing a forearm marked by faint, branching discolorations that resembled mold blooming beneath the surface. As she spoke, the light through the windows dimmed, clouds thickening overhead, and Elias felt the room grow smaller, the air heavier, as though the house itself were leaning in to listen. May's voice dropped to a near whisper when she described dreams shared by every Voss child, dreams of lying in dark, moist earth while something vast and patient waited below, breathing in time with their failing hearts. Harlan shifted in the doorway, and for a moment Elias thought he saw the man's lips move, forming words without sound, words that tasted of soil and endings. The coffee had gone cold in his cup, untouched, and the photographs on the mantel seemed to watch with renewed intensity, their faded eyes tracking every flicker of movement in the room. That afternoon, after leaving May's house, Elias followed a deer trail that climbed the ridge behind the clustered homes, guided by her offhand mention of the old Voss place higher up the hollow. The path was overgrown with briar and laurel, branches snagging at his coat as if reluctant to let him pass. The fog had lifted slightly, but the light remained flat and colorless, turning the trunks of hemlocks into charcoal smudges against the hillside. Each step released the smell of crushed ferns and wet bark, yet the underlying note of rot grew stronger, as though the mountain itself were exhaling through hidden fissures. The cabin appeared without warning, half swallowed by the slope, its roof collapsed inward like a broken ribcage. Vines thick as wrists had claimed the walls, prying clapboards loose and threading through empty window frames. Elias circled the structure slowly, boots sinking into decades of leaf mold, until he found the door hanging crooked on leather hinges. Inside, the air was colder than outside, thick with the scent of earth and long abandonment. Shafts of weak daylight pierced the ruined roof, illuminating dust motes that drifted like slow spores. The single room had once been both kitchen and bedroom, a rusted stove sagged in one corner, its pipe long fallen. A table lay overturned, legs splintered, and against the far wall stood a cradle, small, hand-hewn from oak, darkened almost black by time. Elias approached it cautiously, heart thudding in the silence. The cradle was lined with what had once been a quilt, now reduced to threads and clumps of mildew, and at its bottom lay a scattering of tiny bones, bird-like in fragility, cleaned by insects and decades. He turned away, scanning the floorboards for anything that might remain of Ilara's life. Near the hearth, where stones had shifted and settled, he noticed a loose plank. Kneeling, he worked it free with numb fingers, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside rested a bundle wrapped in oilskin, edges frayed but intact. Unfolding it carefully, he uncovered a diary bound in cracked leather, its pages warped by damp yet still legible. The handwriting was delicate, looping, unmistakably feminine, dated entries spanning years. The first pages spoke of ordinary hardships, failed crops, a husband lost to fever, the ache of childlessness that grew sharper with each passing season. Then the tone shifted, words becoming frantic, describing dreams of voices rising from the soil, promising fertility in exchange for an unnamed price. Elias read by the faint light, breath shallow, as Ilara recounted the night she walked into the clearing and spoke the forbidden words. Subsequent entries detailed her pregnancies, each one marked by strange cravings for raw earth and the sensation of something coiled and patient moving within her. The final pages were stained dark, ink blurred in places by what might have been tears or worse, chronicling the births, each child arriving silent, skin already softening, eyes filmed yet watchful. He sat back on his heels, diary open in his lap, feeling the cabin's chill seep deeper into his bones. Outside, the wind stirred the vines against the walls with a sound like fingers scratching for entry, and in the cradle the tiny bones seemed to shift imperceptibly, settling into new positions as though arranging themselves for sleep. The rot smell thickened, sweet and cloying, coating the back of his throat, while the pages beneath his thumbs grew faintly warm, as if the words themselves still carried the heat of the hand that had written them. Night settled over Black Hollow like a damp shroud, the kind that muffled sound and turned every footfall into a secret. Elias left the ruined cabin with Ilara's diary pressed against his chest, its leather cover now faintly damp, as though it had absorbed moisture from the air or from something deeper. He retraced the deer trail downward, but the woods felt altered. Branches that had snagged at him on the ascent now brushed his shoulders with deliberate slowness, and the hemlocks leaned closer, needles whispering against one another in a language just beyond comprehension. By the time he reached Widow Greer's porch, full dark had fallen, moonless and starless under a ceiling of cloud. The cabin's single lamp glowed behind curtained windows, yet no one answered his knock. He let himself in, finding the room empty. Fire burned low to embers that pulsed like slow heartbeats. Exhaustion pulled at him, but sleep felt unwise. Instead he sat at the scarred table, diary open beneath the lamp's weak circle of light, reading deeper into Ilara's confessions until the words blurred and the margins seemed to crawl with faint, shifting marks that had not been there before. Hours passed unmarked. At some point the lamp guttered, wick drowning in its own oil, yet the room did not plunge into total darkness. A faint luminescence seeped through the window glass, pale, greenish, the color of fungi blooming on fallen logs. Elias rose and crossed to the pane, breath fogging the cold surface. Outside, the fog had thickened into a solid wall, but within it shapes moved, tall, thin silhouettes that swayed rather than walked, drifting between the trunks with no sound of foot on leaf or stone. Then the whispering began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a layered murmur like wind through hollow reeds, yet carrying distinct voices, infantile, wet, gurgling as though spoken through throats half-filled with soil. The sounds formed no clear words at first, only a rhythmic rise and fall that matched the slow pulse he had noticed in the embers. Elias pressed his ear to the glass, unable to pull away. Gradually the voices sharpened, threading together into broken phrases. Memar, cold, come down, hungry. A chill that had nothing to do with mountain air slid beneath his collar and down his spine. In the fog beyond the porch, smaller shapes now detached themselves from the larger ones, low to the ground, crawling with an awkward, dragging motion. They left faint trails of luminescence on the damp earth, trails that glowed briefly before fading, as if the ground drank the light. One of the small forms paused at the edge of visibility, lifting what might have been a face. Even through the distortion of fog and glass, Elias saw the pallor, the soft collapse of features, the dark hollows where eyes should focus but instead seemed to sink inward. The whispering swelled, dozens of voices overlapping now, some pleading, some accusing, all laced with that same wet, decaying timbre. They called not to him directly but past him, toward the diary on the table, toward the bloodline it chronicled, toward the woman who had bargained with what waited below. Elias stumbled back from the window, heart hammering against ribs, and in that moment the lamp flared once bright, impossible, illuminating the room long enough for him to glimpse handprints on the inside of the glass, small, smeared, as though tiny palms slick with mold had pressed there moments before he approached. When the flame died again, the whispering did not cease. It followed him into the corners of the room, curling around his ankles like cold smoke, rising until it filled his ears with the sound of infants breathing their last in unison. He clutched the diary tighter, feeling its pages shift faintly under his fingers, as though something within the ink were stirring in response to the chorus outside. The shapes in the fog pressed closer, their outlines softening further, melting at the edges until they resembled less children than root systems reaching upward through soil, seeking air and warmth they could never truly claim. The morning after the whispering visitation, Elias woke on the floorboards of Widow Greer's cabin, the diary still clutched in his stiff fingers. Frost feathered the inside of the windows, and his breath hung in pale clouds. He built up the fire with shaking hands, then returned to the table, drawn back to Alara's pages as though an invisible thread tugged at his wrists. The entries he had skimmed in the ruined cabin now demanded closer reading, and under the strengthening daylight he traced the slow unraveling of her bargain. She wrote first of her barrenness as a wound deeper than flesh, a silence in her body that echoed the emptiness of the ridges after logging crews had stripped the chestnut groves. Years of stillbirths and miscarriages had left her hollow, until the dreams began, visions of rich black soil parting like flesh, of pale roots reaching upward to cradle something small and new. A voice, neither male nor female, rose from the depths in those dreams, offering life in exchange for surrender. Alara resisted at first, burning sage and scattering salt, but the longing grew until it outshouted fear. On a night when the moon was swallowed by storm clouds, she walked barefoot to the clearing she had seen in sleep. The ground there was softer than anywhere else on the ridge, perpetually damp, exhaling a warmth that should not exist in autumn. In the center lay a flat stone half buried in moss, its surface carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly, lines that curved inward endlessly, suggesting burrows or veins. Alara had carried a tin cup of her own blood, drawn with a sewing needle over days, and a lock of hair from her dead mother. She knelt and spoke the words the dream voice had taught her, syllables that tasted of iron and loam, that vibrated in her teeth like distant thunder rolling through caverns far below the mountain. The earth answered. The stone sank slowly, as though pulled by unseen hands, and from the depression rose a mist thick and grey-green, smelling of turned graves and spring rain at once. It wrapped around her, cool and intimate, pressing against her skin until it seemed to seep through pores and settle low in her belly. Alara felt the moment of conception, not the quick spark of human passion, but a slow, deliberate planting, something ancient taking root in her womb with the patience of stone. The mist withdrew as suddenly as it had come, leaving her kneeling in ordinary mud, the clearing silent except for her ragged breathing. She wrote of the months that followed with a mixture of awe and dawning dread. The child grew heavy quickly, yet its movements were sluggish, dreamlike, as though swimming through thick sap. Cravings came not for pickles or sweets but for soil, handfuls scraped from beneath the porch, eaten in secret until her tongue was black. Her skin took on a faint luminescence in the dark, veins glowing softly like foxfire in rotten wood. When the first birth pains came, they felt less like contractions than like the ground itself shifting, trying to push something upward through her body. The diary's ink grew darker in those final entries, pressed hard into the page as though anger or terror guided the pen. Alara described the emergence of her firstborn, how its skin slid from her slick and already cool, how patches of it bore the delicate filigree of mold even in the first minutes of air. The child did not cry, only exhaled a sigh that carried the scent of deep caves, and when she pressed it to her breast it latched with a hunger that drained warmth from her veins rather than milk. In the margin of one page she had scrawled a single line over and over, the letters deepening with each repetition. I opened the door and it will not close. Elias turned the page slowly, feeling the paper cling to his fingertips as though reluctant to release what came next. The fire popped behind him, sending sparks up the chimney, but the warmth did not reach him. The words seemed to pulse faintly, the same sluggish rhythm he had felt in the moving shapes outside the window, and the smell of damp earth rose from the open diary until the room itself felt like the inside of a burrow, walls pressing closer with every breath. In the days that followed the ritual's revelation, Elias found himself unable to leave the table where Ilara's diary lay open like a wound. He read and reread the entries until the words seemed etched behind his eyelids, appearing whenever he blinked. Sleep came in shallow snatches, broken by the memory of wet whispers and pale shapes drifting beyond the glass. Widow Greer's cabin remained empty save for him, no footsteps on the porch, no creak of the door, only the wind moving through the eaves with a sound like distant sighing. On the third morning he noticed the change. It began with an itch beneath the skin of his left forearm, faint at first, the kind one might attribute to dry air or an insect bite. But when he rolled up his sleeve to scratch, he saw a patch no larger than a coin where the flesh had paled to an unnatural ash-gray, veins beneath it darkened to the color of bruised roots. The skin there felt cooler than the surrounding tissue, and when he pressed a fingertip to it the indentation lingered longer than it should, as though the resilience had seeped away overnight. He told himself it was imagination, fatigue, perhaps a rash from handling the moldering diary, yet the sight of it lodged cold and heavy in his gut. By evening the patch had spread, faint tendrils feathering outward along the inner arm like the delicate branching of mycelium seen under bark. The itch had deepened into a dull ache, not painful but insistent, the sensation of something settling in rather than inflaming. Elias built the fire higher, hoping warmth would drive it back, but the heat seemed to bypass the afflicted skin entirely, leaving it clammy and separate. In the lamplight he examined his reflection in a cracked hand mirror. The hollows beneath his eyes had darkened, taking on a faint bluish tint, and his lips appeared thinner, the color leached toward lavender. That night he dreamed of lying in rich, black soil that pressed softly against his cheeks and chest. Something vast moved far below, a slow turning like seasons shifting in the earth's core, and with each revolution he felt a little more of himself drawn downward, warmth, memory, the sharp edges of thought softening into loam. He woke gasping on the floorboards again, mouth tasting of iron and damp leaves, and when he stumbled to the wash basin he saw that the graying had reached his elbow, the skin there faintly translucent, fine threads visible beneath like pale roots seeking deeper purchase. He tried to leave then, packing the diary into his bag and stepping out into the pre-dawn dark. The truck sat where he had left it, frost thick on the windshield, but when he turned the key the engine coughed once and fell silent, battery drained as though the cold had sipped it dry overnight. Back inside, he sat with his arm bared to the firelight, watching the discoloration creep with the patience of moss on stone. The ache had become a pull now, gentle but relentless, urging him toward rest, toward surrender, toward the cool dark where the whispering voices waited with familiar, infantile hunger. Each hour brought subtle new betrayals, a fingernail loosening at the edge, the whites of his eyes taking on a faint yellow cast, the scent of turned earth rising from his own skin no matter how he scrubbed. The diary lay closed on the table, yet he felt its pages breathing in time with his own slowing pulse, as though the words had taken residence beneath his ribs and begun to spread. When he flexed his fingers, the joints moved with a slight delay, as if the signal traveled through thickening sap rather than blood. The mountain outside pressed closer, the fog thicker against the windows, and in the quiet between heartbeats Elias understood that knowledge of the ritual had opened a door within him too, one that the rot was already slipping through, patient and inevitable, eager to make him fertile ground for what had waited since Ilara first spoke the words. The rot had climbed Elias's arm to the shoulder by the fifth night, threading delicate grey filaments across his collarbone like frost on a windowpane. Movement grew sluggish. Lifting a cup of coffee required concentration, as though his joints were packed with wet clay. The diary no longer needed reading, it lived in him now, phrases surfacing unbidden in the quiet hours, Ilara's looping script superimposed over his vision whenever he closed his eyes. He knew he should flee, yet the truck remained lifeless, and the path down the ridge felt impossibly long, each step heavier than the last. Desperation finally drove him back to May Voss's house under a sky the color of spoiled milk. Harlan answered the door, face more waxen than before, lips parted in a faint, perpetual exhale. Without speaking he stepped aside, and Elias entered to find May and two older cousins gathered around the hearth. Candles burned low on every surface, their flames bending toward the center of the room as though drawn by invisible breath. On the floorboards someone had chalked a wide circle, its edge scattered with handfuls of graveyard soil and fragments of infant bone unearthed from the family plots. May's eyes met his, sorrow and resignation mingled there. "You've read too deep," she said softly. "It's in you now." Only one way to speak to her direct. They seated him inside the circle, pressing the diary into his lap like an offering. Harlan began a low humming, a note that vibrated in the teeth and sternum, while the cousins joined, voices layering into a chord that seemed to rise from the ground itself rather than their throats. The candles flared higher, wax running in sudden rivulets, and the temperature plummeted until Elias's breath bloomed white and lingering. The room darkened further, shadows thickening into shapes that detached from the walls and drifted inward. The humming deepened, resonating in the chalk lines until the soil scattered there began to shift, grains rolling as though something beneath the floorboards pushed upward. A pressure built behind Elias's eyes, and then the center of the circle rippled like disturbed water. She rose slowly, Elara Voss, or what remained of her. Her form was translucent yet solid enough to cast faint shadow, dressed in the same faded dress she had worn in the sepia photographs, now clinging to a body swollen and collapsed in unequal measure. Skin hung in soft folds, mottled with blooms of mold and lichen, yet her face retained a terrible beauty, eyes large and dark, glistening with unshed tears or seepage. Around her drifted smaller shapes, her children, half-formed and translucent, tethered to her by pale umbilical strands that pulsed with sluggish light. They hovered at her skirts, tiny hands reaching, mouths working in silent, wet pleas. Elara's gaze fixed on Elias, and when she spoke her voice came from everywhere, the walls, the hearth, the marrow of his bones. "You sought my story," she said, the words carrying the scent of deep earth and milk gone sour. "Now you carry it." She extended a hand, fingers elongated and soft, nails blackened and splitting, and the rot in his arm answered with a surge of warmth, spreading faster across his chest. The children drifted closer, their hollow eyes reflecting his own paling face, and he understood the truth she offered. They were not her offspring alone but vessels, borrowed wombs for something ancient that wore human shape only long enough to breach the surface. Each birth had been an opening, each half-dead child a route sent upward into the world of air and sunlight. The bargain had never been for healthy babes, it had been for passage. Tears tracked down her ruined cheeks, cutting clean paths through the mold. "I thought I could close the door after," she whispered. "But doors swing both ways." The children pressed against him now, cold and clinging, their touch accelerating the decay in his flesh, and Elias felt the vast patience below stir in recognition, turning its attention fully toward the new vessel it had claimed. Harlan's humming faltered, the cousins averting their eyes, and Elara leaned close enough that he tasted grave damp on her breath as she spoke the final revelation directly into his mind. The rot would not kill him, it would ready him, hollow him, make him fertile for the next planting when the time came to send more harbingers upward through his own undoing body. The circle shattered the moment Elara's revelation settled into Elias like seed into turned soil. The candles snuffed out in a single breath that was not wind, and the chalk lines bled into the floorboards as though the house itself wept black water. Harlan's humming broke into a ragged cough, and May stumbled back, hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with something between grief and relief. The cousins moved swiftly then, no longer mourners but keepers of an older covenant, their faces hardening into masks carved by generations of necessity. Harlan seized Elias's arms from behind, grip surprisingly strong despite the waxen give of his flesh, while the older cousins produced coils of rope stained dark with age and use. Elias struggled, but the rot had sapped his strength. His limbs responded with the delayed obedience of things half-buried. They dragged him from the circle toward the back door, boots scraping across boards that seemed to cling to his heels. May followed, tears cutting clean tracks down her pallid cheeks, murmuring apologies that dissolved into the same wet whisper he had heard beyond the windows. Outside, the fog had lifted just enough to reveal a narrow path leading higher into the ridge, one Elias had not noticed before. Torches flickered to life in the cousins' hands, bundles of fatwood and rag that burned with a greenish flame, casting light that made the hemlocks look bruised and swollen. They marched him upward, the ground growing softer underfoot, sucking at boots with wet, reluctant sounds. The air thickened with the smell of fresh-turned earth, though no spade had broken it recently, The mountain itself seemed to exhale in anticipation. Halfway up, the path opened into a small clearing ringed by ancient oaks whose roots twisted above ground like pale intestines. In the center waited a pit, newly dug and lined with stones blackened by old fires. Elias understood immediately this was the place of appeasement, where the Voss bloodline fed the bargain when it grew too hungry. They forced him to the edge, ropes binding his wrists and ankles with practiced knots, and May knelt before him one last time. "We tried to keep it in the family," she whispered, voice breaking. "But you brought new blood up here. It wants balance. If we give it you, maybe it stays quiet a while longer. Maybe the children stop coming early." Harlan and the cousins lifted him then, swinging his body over the pit with the ease of ritual repeated across decades. Below, the darkness was absolute, yet Elias sensed movement, slow shifting, patient uncoiling, the vast thing Alara had invited now stirring in recognition of fresh offering. The ropes creaked as they lowered him inch by inch, the torch's green light shrinking above until it became distant stars in a closing sky. May's face was the last thing he saw, pale and sorrowful, before the edges of the pit eclipsed her and the earth smell rose to swallow him whole. The descent felt endless, the air growing warmer and thicker, rich with the scent of fermentation and deep time. Something brushed against his boots, soft, questing, tasting, and the rot in his body answered with a surge of eager warmth, spreading through chest and throat until his lungs filled with the taste of loam. Voices rose around him now, not whispers but a chorus of welcome, infantile and ancient at once, drawing him downward into the patient dark where the mountain's true hunger waited to fold him into its slow, inexorable gestation. In the suffocating warmth of the cavern, time lost its edges. Elias no longer measured days or nights, only the slow, tidal pulse of the thing that cradled him, its tendrils woven through what remained of muscle and bone, feeding on the last heat of his humanity while preparing the hollowed vessel for its purpose. The half-dead children nestled close, their cool bodies pressed against his softening sides, murmuring contentment in wet, wordless sounds as the rot completed its work. His skin had sloughed away entirely now, replaced by a pale, fibrous sheath shot through with luminous veins that carried not blood but the mountain's patient sap. Thought came sluggishly, dreamlike, yet a fragment of awareness lingered, sharp enough to feel the first stirrings deep in his abdomen, small, deliberate movements, like roots testing soil before pushing upward. When the gestation ripened, the vast presence shifted, contracting gently to expel him. The cavern walls narrowed, pressing from all sides until he was forced upward through a birth canal of stone and loam, the children's hands guiding, their whispers rising into a chorus of farewell and welcome. Soil parted above him in a slow cascade, cool air rushing in to kiss the new, soft surface of his body. He emerged into moonlight that filtered weakly through thinning fog, crawling on hands that left damp prints on frost-rimed grass, dragging himself from the pit's mouth like something newly whelped. The ropes lay severed beside the filled-in shaft, the clearing empty of torches or watchers. May and the others had gone, their duty done, the hunger sated enough to grant the village a season of quiet. Elias rose unsteadily, joints moving with the fluid grace of fungus rather than bone, and stumbled down the ridge path. His truck waited where he had left it, battery inexplicably revived, engine turning over on the first try as though the mountain itself released him to carry its seed beyond the hollow. He drove through the night, windows down to the cold December air that no longer chilled him. The rot pulsed warmly beneath the luminous sheath of his skin, the tiny lives within shifting in slow anticipation, already half-claimed by decay yet eager for the world above. Towns blurred past, small clusters of lights that winked out behind him until the roads widened and the mountains fell away into flatter, unfamiliar land. He did not stop until dawn grayed the horizon, pulling onto a quiet suburban street where houses slept behind drawn curtains and Christmas lights blinked in mechanical cheer. There he sat behind the wheel, hands resting on a belly that had begun to swell with unnatural weight, feeling the sluggish kicks of what grew inside. The children's whispers followed him still, threading through his thoughts like roots through soil, promising that the door remained open, the cycle unbroken. Somewhere far behind, the Appalachians brooded under fresh snow, patient as ever, while Elias, now the new bearer, the latest mother of rot, waited for the season to turn, for the births that would come already tainted, half-dead harbingers sent outward to soften new ground for what waited eternally below. The rot within him bloomed sweeter now, ripe with promise, and in the quiet of the sleeping neighborhood he felt the first faint contraction, the slow, inexorable beginning of the next planting.